Hi everyone, I'm Khalid, and I'm conflicted. As I get older, I begin to face the burning question that every hobbyist tends to ask in the face of the day-to-day. After the job, the errands, the schedules, the duties, the chores, the whatever else, how much of me is left for what I love to do? Almost 3 years ago, I became a freelancer in Los Angeles, using remote flexibility to work both day shifts and night shifts, meaning my relaxation came at odd hours. I lugged myself home some nights, desperate to use those few hours to escape, to take a break from taxes, to meander at place, watch some trees blow in the wind, or slice through a guy's femur. What do you get when you cross magnificent Japanese vistas a la Akira Kurosawa with the open-world quest and base system of a Ubisoft game?
You're a samurai.
I don't know, but I'm all in. In the wake of the cinematic genre role-playing, Ghost of Tsushima fills the need for the samurai typifying you've been clamoring for, and quicker than you can say, my culture's not your costume, boy, does she deliver.
Never seen it before.
So much so that instead of spending my little time chopping up invaders and saving Japan, there were countless memories of throwing on my headphones, immersing myself in the world, and finding myself sat next to a wonderfully rendered riverside, listening to the trees, the breeze, and the trickling streams of feudal Japan.
You look tired.
The shock of an idealized 13th century Japan, heightened by a day and night cycle with enough god rays to make you say, "Oh my god." Golden jaws of life pry the world bare before you. Sacred forests of knee-high pampas grass tickle your thighs, and god damn it, he tickles it back. And the natural breeze carries you away. Carries you away, but to where specifically? To death, to loss, to betrayal, and also to beauty, silence. The way when you pause and look up into the trees, the rest of the soundscape just kind of trickles away except for the rustling of leaves. As Americans, we're used to the high-octane change and manifest destiny, but how true is that across the world? Because for once, it wasn't conflict and blood sport that brought me back to the blade every late night. It was something you didn't fight. Here you're led by acceptance, and this is a huge thing that we'll have to come back to. And I'd hate for you to get lost among the forest. In truth, Ghost of Tsushima didn't make any of these experiences up. It's an homage to the roots of Eastern philosophy, an homage to the filmic tradition that preceded it, both Japanese and elsewhere. The obvious ones, Kurosawa, Kobayashi, Mizumi. But as we'll discover, the bones of these themes don't stop at the surface level, the visual, but instead drive a rushing river through the very veins of this work, leaving its ruby bluff across any surface it finds. Kishotenketsu. What does it mean? Before I begin, the onus is on me to tell you I'm not Japanese. Cultural norms and their inferences are specific and complicated enough for the people who grew up with them, not to mention the endless nuances onto which the steam train of storytelling itself barrels, like layers and layers which weave over time a quilt of context. There are those who are much closer to it than I am. And that's okay, because our story begins in a much different place. And for me personally, there are traditions much closer to home. Hollywood loves confrontation. Action movies, shoot-em-ups, all your John Wicks and...
Jesus Christ, that's Jason Bourne.
And as all but 3 of the world's top 100 grossing films of all time are American-made,
it's evident that the United States excels in exporting one thread and one thread only. Relatable protagonist overcomes the de facto manifestation of their opposite and comes out the other side completely changed.
Most impressive.
That is the basic motif of the hero journey. Finding the source of life to bring you forth of the condition.
also named the Hollywood format. Wonder why that is. A function of this is often called the character's want versus need, desire versus plot goal, or as Keith Cunningham spells out in The Soul of Screenwriting, the mode versus the need. But the motion of the story's plot hinges on a character's idea of who they are and their value structure, or their mode, being eventually superseded by the need they didn't know they had in the first act, and whose realization will bring about the violent destruction of their antithesis in Act 3.
Well, who in society today is making any heroic myth at all for us? Do movies do this? Do movies create hero myths?
I don't know.
Peter thinks he has to prove his worth through relation to the Avengers, but instead defeats a tech-obsessed man by using homegrown strength and being himself. Alan Grant has to square off with his lack of care for kids or anyone by struggling to survive together. So this is the motion of all Western movies. This is your Harry Potters, your Stars, be them wars or ship troopered.
I'm doing my part.
This is the cathartic chronology argument of all three-act plot structures in an easy-bake simplicity so ubiquitous and effectual that French New Wave artist Jean-Luc Godard, curator of your least compelling cinema history class, was adamant to call it the ugly hegemony of American cinema. A rolling, money-making wave of capitalist aesthetic that dominated it, and one that seeks to give palatable and predictable catharsis, and never to broken the sharing of ideas.
I'm ugly and I'm proud. I am ugly and I'm proud.
You are the only ones who invent stories. Just you don't care about who receive it.
What an American patriot. To Godard, this convention of black and white conflict stole from humanity the very nuance of its raison d'etre, and turned it into a cash cow aiming to weaponize the very predilection of man to overcome and melt it down into something basic, something palatable, something that thrives on the black and white and the blatant.
C'est vraiment dégueulasse. Each of us has a destiny, for good or for evil.
Few people become conscious without having to become conscious, without being driven to it by necessity, and this is where evil comes in. When I was growing up, all of this had been figured out.
This will be the writer's year, man.
By the time I was old enough to sell my soul to the tune of tens of thousands of dollars on a lucrative education in screenwriting,
Great choice. No sarcasm.
storytelling as a whole had already been plotted into a rigid, inarguable structure with some pretty noticeable curves.
Extra thick.
So, whether you take it from Blake Snyder or Gustav Freytag or Sid Field,
The three-act structure heavily codified the historicity of the need mode method. And while it is normally misattributed to the incorrigibly handsome 4th century scholar Aristotle,
who actually touted an identical two-act structure, what we can be assured of is this Dashing Devils 2 and the contemporary 3 can be overlaid almost perfectly, such that if we're going to get to the bottom of conflict, it would actually help to start at its most serious contributor.
What's funny about Bickus Dickus?
So between tutoring Macedonia's own Alexander the Great to be decent at being great, Aristotle laid out in 335 BC the earliest surviving work of literary theory, aptly named Poetics. In it, the prolific philosopher proposed a thesis that stands to reshape dramaturgy as we know it, when he said,
a beginning is that which does not itself follow anything by causal necessity. An end, on the contrary, is that which itself naturally follows some other thing. Alright, so a beginning begins things and an ending ends them. Okay, so maybe not so revolutionary today.
My work is done here.
What do you mean your work is done? You didn't do anything.
But observing the statement for what it is within the context of the time period it was said sheds new light on the discovery. As Keith Cunningham writes, it is the specific shape of growth through crisis, and in Aristotle's time, it really did constitute a revolutionary new way of looking at the world. It was a revolution because these earlier dramas always involved conflict between man and God. Does man have free will, or does he not? And is that a good thing or a bad thing? Imagine you're at the table for Christmas. You've got your casserole and your holiday ham cooked about just right, and the kids at the kiddie table are all dressed like the three wise men and Mary. Everybody knows the story.
Greetings. We heard there is a baby.
There's no tension or irony, not really a beginning, middle, or end. It's just a telling of events that challenges nothing. The question for Aristotle is, was this drama? Well, this is the bedrock for all storytelling in history, anthropologists know. That bull on the wall in the Lascaux cave, not much for twists and dramatic irony.
So Cunningham posits that the difference in this early pageantry evidenced in the early civilizations all across the world, and the specific drama that Aristotle began to take note of, is the very instant of the rise of dramatic character-based conflict.
Die! Rather than engaging in storytelling that was rigid, and with the purpose of pedagogical event retelling, drama, at least in the Western world, was born due to one massively influential trend with godlike importance.
They began to question God.
In the age where a story's tension would hinge on the protagonists tumbling into fate against their will, Aristotle began to see what was a dangerous trend of protagonists who debated if following God's will
was even the right thing to do.
Because Athens had become the kingdom of the mind. Aristotle and others placed reason over mystery.
So, where are we right now in history?
At this point, Brahmins in India were deciding awakened human consciousness trumped the pantheon. Rome's conquering of lands was a Trojan horse for the newfangled theory of non-essentialism, and the dramatic tension of suddenly having the power to determine your fate and your individualism began in just the same way and by the same groups of people as standard philosophical argumentation. By the way, argumentation?
We'll come back to that later.
Fast forward to today, and 2,300 years later, 7.5 billion human beings and 14 land before time, not much has changed in drama, to the point where you'd be forgiven if you thought the linear character conflict plot structures of the West were the only compelling way to draft storytelling. Under this, the question becomes, how else could we engage with the story without the character rising to the dominion of their shadow self and becoming what we'd all wish to be, the master of a brand new world, what Nietzsche called the lion stage of his three metamorphoses and what would lead into his Übermensch? Well, what if they didn't? In 2021, I'd been living in Los Angeles, and to my excitement, dragged my partner along to Brain Dead Studios, and to a late showing of The Eternal Sunshine of a Spotless Mind.
And honestly, I'm quite proud of being the first video essayist to ever talk about Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, and so I'll do my best to start with a very memorable spoiler warning on account of the memory wiping.
108 minutes later, my excitement was met by her with a look of polite dismay. Putting aside even that the main character, Joel, is selfish, stubborn, and mean-spirited,
I was just trying to be nice.
The French-directed film seemingly hung all of its hats on the Jim Carrey horse and didn't even bother to solve his character. You know, the point of storytelling. So much so that the film just ends without resolving many loose ends in who he is. Remember, the movie famously emphasizes an ending without really ending at all. Why? The movie's ending is a shakeup for American audiences, many showering it with near religious acclaim and others expressing inability to root for any of the main characters.
See, here's where Aristotle screwed the pooch, presumably hypothetically.
In a culture rocketed through individualism and coming down the mountain having defeated our Nietzsches or Jungs or whoever else is dragging, of course we thrive on strong character myths conquering the old world and entering the new. In this way, Joel didn't conquer his old world. Not entirely. Both he and Clementine retain their stubbornness, their brashness. We leave our time with them on a dour note, in fact, in which they will certainly separate again in the future.
Okay.
Okay.
Their characters are unresolved. They have not reached catharsis from what Joseph Campbell calls the contagion of sin, disobedience to the divine will, and death, identification with the moral form. If only that wasn't the point. I want a poem which abandons the commonplace and lifts me, at least for a short time, above the dust and grime of the workaday world. Not one which rouses my passions to an even greater pitch than usual. There are no plays, however great, which are divorced from emotion, and few novels in which considerations of right and wrong play no part. The trademark of the majority of playwrights and novelists is their inability to take even one step out of this world. Western poets in particular take human nature as their cornerstone and are so oblivious to the existence of the real realm of pure poetry. Consequently, when they reach its borders, they come to a halt because they are unaware of anything that lies beyond. In 1991, Japan released a uniquely controversial game show. This is Hajimete no Otsukai. Or, as you might have heard it in English, Old Enough. Here, children as young as 1 or even 2 years old are sent on hidden camera journeys through their idyllic small towns to shop for groceries, transfer documents, or just generally be adorable.
I'm sure it was cute, but I'm not sure that's great parenting.
It's might be a skip for me, honestly.
For Western audiences, this released with a massive twist
that shook the core of the conceit when the unthinkable happened.
Nothing at all happened. Japan has an unshakable relationship with collectivism.
And while this is something of a point of contention, scholars Yotaro Takano and Aiko Osaka published this paper in 1999 where 14 out of 15 studies evidence its entire falsehood. Japanese terms like murashikai, or village society, have risen to prominence. In a murashikai, homogeneity develops through mutual surveillance. But this is not necessarily uncomfortable for its members, as the resulting comfortable space is dominated by a system of mutual pampering. So in 1906, when Japanese poets like the guy I quoted earlier, just years after Nietzsche's Übermensch, that Western writers are wholly unable to escape their own heads in crises, unable to lose themselves in the external world around them, it's no wonder what world he was looking to. A culture so enshrined in harmony and balance with the external and nature that, hell, the nation's original name was the very word for harmony. And this, scholars argue, is precisely where one could pinpoint the divide between Eastern and Western rhetoric. In ancient civilization, it's Socrates versus Confucius. It's the individuality of virtue ethics, of man being measure of all things, versus the communality of Buddhism. The bootstraps growth of Disney versus the embedding into nature and balance of Miyazaki. If a Western writer was able to step just a foot away from the threshold of inner turmoil, where they are the main character defeating the dragon,
so that if we happen not to be heroes in the grand sense of redeeming society, we have to take that journey ourselves, spiritually, psychologically.
And instead open up to the immutability of community and the nature around them, Sasaki posits, then maybe, just maybe, the culture of storytelling in the West would be steeped less in self-gratifying character conflict and individualism, and maybe in something worldly, something mysterious, something thematic, something like... Well, of course, theme is thematic, so... But what does it mean to be a theme? Lit Charts defines theme as
a universal idea, lesson, or message explored throughout a work of literature. One whose aim is not to simply apply to the specific characters and events of a work, but instead to paint a brush of universality. To express broader truths towards a larger ecosystem or gestalt. Something that doesn't hinge on the truths of the individual, but of a truth plurality.
But before we do that, if we're not going to imagine storytelling as hinging on necessary conflict, we're going to have to address the elephant in the room.
The question of function, and how the hell we even tell a story catering only to the theme. The truth is, we do it all the time.
That seems to be his theme here.
Strictly speaking, theme-oriented storytelling mostly becomes a didactic method.
Whether it's political cartoons or comics, we're meant to be challenged on a preconceived notion or argue the status quo.
Viewed in the abstract, books like Nietzsche's own Thus Spoke Zarathustra and Voltaire's Candide would be considered peak thematic storytelling, where the central driving force isn't a protagonist conflict meant to be resolved by the end, but rather an evolving exploration of a central concept being debated out, like the destruction of nihilism, or the optimistic irony of fatalism.
Also included in Candide is the optimistic toleration of rape and murder, because it happens to have also brought with it chocolate. So, not everything is good.
Remember, unlike the Western world, the Eastern world was evolving through direct influence of their collectivism.
So it stands to reason that in the ancient world, Eastern storytellers needed to develop a specific convention of storytelling, not to defeat your Jungian shadow, but for social cohesion.
And digging in the ancient world, scholars found it not yet in Japan, but a bit west in China.
The story goes that in the Tang Dynasty, right around 661 AD, among the economic boom of the Silk Road, the theme-centric storytelling approach, then called Shichongzonhei, which I'm sure I'm messing up, was worked as a structure to poetry, saying that
Qi needs to be level and straight, Qing needs to be the shape of a mortar, Tuan needs change, and He needs to be like some deep pond or overflowing river, or needs to leave the readers pondering over the meaning. 4 different beats, 4 distinct subdivisions. But how impactful could a change this small be?
Turns out, pretty impactful. Throughout the next few tens of centuries, Chichonzonhei took off like gangbusters. I mean, it was only one of the two major storytelling conventions outside of the eight-legged essay, the Baguren, making the schoolyard essay the second scariest thing on 8 legs.
Eventually making its way to Korea as the Kichongjongyo. And yes, when the first novel ever in history is penned by a court assistant in Heian period Japan, it is the Kishotenketsu that this prose is measured against. But it wasn't content to impact storytelling alone. Shishonzonhei quickly became the epitome and bedrock of how logic is displayed in the literary East for quite some time, as detailed in contrastive rhetoric, a process developed by American linguist Robert Kaplan in 1966, by which language and writing are analyzed as cultural phenomena and through which one can examine minute differences across cultures.
Palestinian academic Edward Said later rallied against it, rightfully for it being Anglo-centric and kind of ignorant, but we won't get too far into that here. For more information, check out the 1978 book Orientalism, an unfortunate book title that I'm very uncomfortable to say on YouTube.
In any case, the argument goes like this. As Chichonzonhei morphed into Kishotenketsu and kept the general blocks of form, the prevalence of the form embedded in culture and pedagogy began to give as much to the culture's way of thinking as it took. As Kaplan observed with Japanese students as late as the 70s, Eastern rhetoric and logic followed the same inductive path. In his eyes, Japanese students tended to begin argumentation with a long, indirect introduction of the topic, which is further developed in the second part, followed by an abrupt transition where the author's real point and theme is interjected before all previous parts are brought together in a nicely wrapped conclusion. For this, let's consider this yonkama, the most prototypical example from the 18th century.
Daughters of Itoya, in the Honmachi of Osaka.
This is the key, the setting.
The elder daughter is 16, and the younger one is 14.
This is the sho, the logical development of the story. We have a pretty good idea of what's happening, but then...
Throughout history, daimyo killed the enemy with bows and arrows.
The 10, the change of perspective that has nothing to do with what we know so far. We are at the edge of our dissonance between this new ideal and the last one. Then...
The daughters of Itoya kill with their eyes. Ooh, spooky.
The conclusion, Ketsu, that brings harmony by teaching us what each of the other sections could bring into each other. The daughters haven't grown, they haven't overcome some Olympic hurdle through conflict, and yet we do feel catharsis from the state of unease that 10 left us in, and have grown to a new understanding of the theme of women in this period.
You'd be forgiven for thinking that doesn't constitute story, but Japanese historians would say take a closer look. It has characters, it has information that it's relating to you that does evolve from beginning to end. Hell, it even has conflict. It's just that that conflict is not necessary and inherent within the thematic growth. Kishotenketsu has given an idea and catharsis without much need for conflict.
And if it does seem vague and a roundabout way to tell a story, that too is by design, as long as John Hines has it in 1987 that while English is writer responsible and puts the onus on writers for presenting their views clearly, Hines classifies Japanese as a reader responsible language. He found that Japanese writers do not tend to give clarification or full explanations of their views. Instead, they drop hints and leave behind nuances. This type of prose earns high praise from Japanese readers because it offers them opportunities to savor the mystification of language.
I'm definitely going to start using that as an excuse to send emojis or one-word texts. I'm not lazy, it's just the mystification of language. Look it up.
And it's this nuance that leaves its mark throughout Japanese storytelling, all without a contingent conflict. In My Neighbor Totoro, it's Ki, Satsuki Mei and her dad are moving to a new house, exploring nature. Sho, the sisters find spirits inhabit their home in their nearby forests, and meets the chaotically playful Totoro. 10, we learn that the girl's mother is in the hospital with an unknown chronic condition, and Mei runs away from home to see her. Ketsu, merging the secular world and the magical, Satsuki reaches out to Totoro, who takes her in his cat-shaped bus to find her sister, synthesizing the theme of attachment.
In Murakami's colorless Tsukuru Tazaki, it's...
Tsukuru Tazaki is a death-obsessed 36-year-old still dealing with the trauma of his childhood friend group disowning him. So Tazaki starts seeing a girl and decides to find all his old friends. But he learns one of his friends, Shiro, has accused him of rape, causing a tense conversation with another of their friends. Merging his dissection of his current relationships and the discovery of his past, Tazaki returns to Japan, synthesizing the theme of impermanence. Super Mario 3D Land director Koichi Hayashida detailed, the levels begin with a safe introduction of mechanics, different unsafe variations of the mechanic are rolled out, a completely different challenge is introduced, possibly an enemy type. The original mechanic and new twisted challenge are combined, synthesizing a new understanding of the intro mechanic.
So from Chinese poetry in the Tang Dynasty to Japanese manga structure, Kishotenketsu has evolved as the foundation of a significant portion of Eastern storytelling. So while Western writers are focused on clarity from ancient Greece, the Japanese assume a social cohesion and are oriented towards indirectness and nuances in theme. From here, you could pretty much guess where we're headed. Or you could, if it weren't for... a blanket of night. The warm coastal mists of Japan roll in brazen tufts of low-lying wind, and, together with sharp blades of grass, make way for the crush of hooves. 80 stalwart samurai, drenched in anxious troughs of sweat, facing them, scores and scores of the evading Mongol fleet.
Today, I die for my people.
There is no clearer conflict. When American game developer Sucker Punch Productions decided in 2014 to follow up its critical bangers of Sly Cooper and the infamous franchise, it had a couple things on its mind. First and foremost, to create a living, breathing, open world even stronger and even more lived in than the alleys and espresso-drunk streets of their previously crafted hometown, Seattle, Washington. How exactly does one whittle that down? Which market responses tend to dictate what is impactful in video gaming and what isn't. A year before, and you had storytelling juggernauts, Grand Theft Auto 5, Beyond Two Souls, Assassin's Creed Black Flag. A year after, Metal Gear Solid Phantom Pain, The Witcher 3, and with Second Son achieving the highest fidelity and largest map of any game so far for a developer known for reinventing the platforming genre. Pressure was on for SP and its creative director Nate Fox to carve something dynamic, impactful, and cinematic to the table. And at E3 2018, it did.
Suddenly you knew who the heroes were, who the villains were. It all clicked. And you had a video game.
And for sure, a video game they had. 6 years of development were put to work for Ghost of Tsushima, an ambitious title for an otherwise all-American company. There was only one problem. They were all American.
To me, the best, most romantic location there is feudal Japan.
Consultation historian, experts on Japanese dialects and religions from the 13th century, creative director Jason Connell began to pull out all the stops. They flew a number of us to Japan and helped us with a 10 or 11 day guided tour with a historian through central Japan. We actually got to go to the beach that the invasion happened on, which is Komodohama. They were very supportive early on.
Our balls are in your court.
And their support paid off, because in July 2020, Ghost of Tsushima was launched. And while taken for granted were some historical fiction liberties, such as removing the clunky period-accurate 13th century armor, adding the use of the katana, the Korean hwacha, and the inclusion of haiku instead of the 31-syllable waka. But between you and me, we can look past some of those concessions.
While the cat lounges.
Ghost of Tsushima had made an example of the genre as a critical smash hit, one that would receive high praise from both the Japanese and Americans for its commitment to the genre as a video game. But it is a video game.
It all clicked. Who the heroes were, who the villains were, and you had a video game.
If the Eastern ethos, especially in that medieval Kamakura period, was to be harmonic and nuanced like the samurai, was there a place for this in Hollywood action games? In Rules of Play, designers Katie Salen and Eric Zimmerman describe conflict as one of several fundamental characteristics of games, without which a game indeed could hardly be called a game. And others describe walking simulators like Gone Home and Dear Esther as mere ashes, inviting the player to discover who started the fire, how it burned, and how it was finally put out. These aren't the ashes to watch from afar. This is the burning fire. It seems important and it seems obvious that even when games are quiet and low stakes, games need conflict. So here we are. A 2020 samurai video game created in the heart of Nirvana's own armpit of Seattle, Washington. If architecture, religions, and language were kept intact, would the storytelling conventions of the time get a shout-out? Would they fall by the anachronistic wayside of haikus, katanas, weapons of war? Where is Kishotenketsu in Ghost of Tsushima? Well, for that we need a chart. So Ghost of Tsushima is self-divided into 4 parts, which does a lot of the work for us, honestly.
Good.
So there's the teaser, Protagonists Jin Sakai and the 79 Samurai are faced with decimation at the assumedly foul-smelling hands of Khotan-kan, the Khans having just sailed from the southern tip of Korea down to the last line of defense before mainland Japan.
Back inside, now!
Jin bands together with Yuna to find the other survivor, his uncle and sworn lord, but unfortunately, kinda gets his ass kicked. Act 1, Rescue Lord Shimura has Jin picking himself up and, together with Yuna, recruiting some help to save Tsushima from the Mongol hands, simultaneously surprising himself with his first honorless killing as the Ghost. Besides that, it goes off without a hitch, really. Jin recruits more help, but kills his best friend along the way, the usual, before what in screenwriting we would call the midpoint, where Jin descends more into the Ghost and reaches his ultimate moment of introspection and fully betrays his sworn duty.
Divide me!
I did what I had to.
Jesus Christ.
The third and final act contains what is called the Dark Night of the Soul, the lowest moment in the piece where Jin escapes his uncle's prison before he flees north and takes down Khotan-kan.
You will be forgotten.
Heading back home and giving the player a choice of letting his shogun-obsessed uncle go and forever being a disgrace,
That's enough writing.
or putting him out of his misery.
Find me in the next life.
Either way, embracing the new and desolate life as the Ghost. So right off the bat, it's a pretty surface level story. And using Campbell's monomyth, also known as the hero's journey, we can pretty accurately parse out where the beats of the game would go. Whether it's the catalyst occurring 10% into the game when Jin makes his first ghost kill, or at 94% when he kills Khotan-kan and can now face his uncle and his identity to resolve the plot.
Write the last words of Clan Sakai.
The story is extremely linear. Don't get me wrong, the stakes ramp, the tension is there, and I shed a healthy amount of Bushido tears at a handful of scenes. Here's looking to you, Yuriko.
I feared you were dead!
But there's a reason the consistent pressure and anti-upping feels distinctly Hollywood, and unsurprisingly, it has to do with the structure. Back to the books. Kaplan suggests that different rhetorical styles represent different sequences of thought. Hines sees English as a hierarchical deductive model, which expository writers are consistently taught at school. Whereas if you ask the Japanese, he thus argues that Japanese writing is more commonly based on an inductive style, and labels it, along with Thai, Korean, and Chinese, as having delayed introduction of purpose. Delayed introduction of purpose, besides being the harshest burn to come out of a scientific paper, is key here. Deductive versus inductive. Cousins of each other under rhetoric, but it's under this lens that the propensity of a narrative to state outright what the goal is, say, Jin Sakai needs to become the Ghost and spend the length giving evidence to this point, is a clear Western signifier. Compare that to a Murakami book where you don't really understand where it's going as you're reading, but when you get to the end, you can at least lie to your friends that you understood the whole time.
What was his point? I have no idea.
So if you spent all of your time fighting for Jin Sakai's evolution into the Ghost of Tsushima, so far, Kishotenketsu unsatisfied. But you didn't, did you?
Ghost of Tsushima is meant to be an anthology of stories. It's not just Jin Sakai's transformation from samurai to ghost.
I really like the story about the girl trained to be really expert for an arrow. And that is very, very interesting, like a human drama around her.
Don't move.
Sensei Ishikawa is an expert of the bow, and he's your instructor, or he would have been, had he not refused to train you in your search of Bushido mastery. You see, Ishikawa's been around the block. In fact, he's sort of a hollow Batgirl. He's seen senseless wars before, and when we meet him, it is in the service of enlisting his help to take back Tsushima. But besides the very first mission, the tale of Sensei Ishikawa, they are an optional set of side quests. See, Ishikawa has his own problem. After setting out to join Jin on the shore, Sensei is attacked by bandits.
Bloody footprints.
Convenient.
The samurai is never caught by surprise.
So that was a fucking lie.
And this is where we enter the picture. See, on the way to saving, and then hunting the star student turned Mongol sympathizer Tomoe, things aren't entirely black and white.
You said the only way up was to climb.
No, I said you had to climb.
Because after Ishikawa admitting to his imperfection, Jin discovers a cornered heart, with nothing but the burning need to survive driving her forward.
It's already over.
Sound familiar?
They're the same picture.
At the end of the quest, Ishikawa attempts to strike down his close friend, but the bow lowers in silent acceptance. And as Tomoe drifts off toward the mainland, an arrow without direction, he instead warns Jin against making the same mistakes he had.
Promise me you won't repeat my mistakes.
I loved this side quest.
And though the internet taught me fairly quickly that I was in the minority position, most players lamented the attempt to completely absolve Tomoe's crimes by the latter half, I was impressed by the succinct character work and natural sense of understanding that comes with spending large amounts of time with an ally, only to realize that they are part of the problem.
What we're left with is a story that must flow, must raise the interest over a long period of time, and must give the character many different perspectives on his quest, but nothing that can fundamentally change the character in case the player skips all of this.
But is this Kishotenketsu? If we lay the quest out, there are independent missions covering the bulk of chasing after Tomoe and her frat boy shenanigans we could call the beginning key. Opening up with Ishikawa asking to help track down his student, which, given a clear cause and effect, you can guess what logically comes next for the show.
He turned it against me.
Information is revealed, fights happen.
The argument is clear. Without a strict code to adhere to, Jin, you're a monster.
Not everyone can be a samurai.
But we're all killers.
But then, 70% through the tale, we open on a wide expanse. Things are quieter here. The game wants us to evolve our understanding about the theme.
Please, excuse me, my lord.
This is Matsu. She's been alone since she was a kid, lost in the wind.
Have to reset it.
And equally as underdeveloped are her moral guidelines. She's never talked to a real samurai. Her hunting of animals to survive is dotted with a meeting of minds over what constitutes murder, Bushido code, and survival. And aren't they all the same thing?
We have darkness in us. If we didn't, we'd be dead.
Sensei Ishikawa said something similar. But it sounds more natural coming from you, Tomoe.
Matsu is Tomoe. Perhaps the greatest living archer and traitor to her people of Tsushima. You've been chasing her this entire time. Through her prodding around reasoning, we've been given an unexpected look into an argument exactly parallel to the first premise. Since Jin has no code, and Jin is still good, can all those without a code be good?
Jin, you can stay the night.
No, Tomoe. I can't.
Two opposing sets of information, and in the middle, we hang unbalanced.
Yet through the inductive argumentation, giving evidence for those without code, and showing the effect of those without a code having the potential for good, when we reach the end of the tale, Ketsu, we are free to do the math and create our own ruling. Ishikawa is wrong. He doesn't have the full picture. And so is Tomoe. She doesn't have the full picture either. Both of their characters are incomplete, but through their anecdotes, we as an audience have the full picture and have gone through it. The theme in 4 parts has reached harmony. If you're gonna have a game with a historical setting, there has to be something relatable at the heart of it. There has to be something that speaks to all of us as 21st century people. There has to be something universal in the story, and that, for me, is the emotional heart of the game. This transformation he has got to go through. To let go of who you've always been and what you've always believed, to become something new. And we can all relate to that, I think.
When I was summing this up, I thought about all of the ways that the Tale of Ishikawa is not a perfect example. The two sets of information through the show and the Ketsu, while orbiting the same theme, could easily be seen as a sort of zero-sum game, where one ideology must win over the other in a necessary conflict.
But through taking a step back and letting the player live through wonder to show perspective before putting the pieces together themselves, we are saved the domineering effect of a more linear world. In that world, Ishikawa is right because he dominated Tomoe. In another world, she is right because she destroyed Ishikawa. Either one would have defeated their old world to create their new, but the audience's understanding would have gone unchallenged. When in 1959, a 37-year-old American poet, Jack Kerouac, attempted to create an American form of the Japanese haiku, he noted that the American haiku is not exactly the Japanese haiku. That it be free of all poetic trickery and make a little picture and yet be as airy and graceful as a Vivaldi pastorella. And lastly, that it be completely packed with void of whole. In transferring the likes of Basho or Moritake to an American audience, the nuances and specifics seemed elusive. In their simplicity, poems were timeless, universal, meant to be meditated and added to. And in this way, specific heroes and the dragons they face aren't the point. Because the point of storytelling is as subjective and varied as those who tell the stories, whether it's intended for unity or for evolution, for the latest in next-gen gaming, or the very beginnings of novelization. Jinsekai isn't tied to being a monster. Changing from a code doesn't require dissent. A bow doesn't only have the capacity to destroy. And as I sat at night by a misty lakefront, I realized storytelling can be more.
What lies ahead? I am like an arrow, shot from a bow. Who knows where the wind will take me?
Test, test, test. Hey everybody, I just want to say thank you for watching my first ever video essay. It's baby's first video essay. Don't know why I said that. Real weird to say that. My goal is to bring media literacy from games back to books and vice versa, back and forth. And it's just really fun to do this for you guys. Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye.